Hi, my name's Alan Journet. I am here to talk to you about, continue the discussion from last time about the implications of the climate trends and projections that I talked about last time. And I thought what I'd do was start with a slide which depicts on a global sense what's been happening temperature-wise, and this includes 2025. One of the things that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been alerting us to is we really should be trying to keep the global warming to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial condition. And what this chart shows is that 2023, 24, and 25 each have part of the year at least above that 1.5 degrees. And what's most disturbing about this is the first 3-year average where the global temperature has been above 1.5 degrees centigrade over that pre-industrial condition. So the message is things are not getting any better. We are not doing enough to address the climate crisis. Now, last time I talked to you about the trends and projections, and I thought before I start today looking at the implications, I should do a quick reminder of what the historical trends have been and what the projections are for Oregon. So here we're looking at the Oregon average temperature change projections to 2020, 2100, and these are based on three scenarios. The Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 5, which is the darker orange to red data set. The orange is Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 3, and Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 2 is the blue line. Remember, Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 5 is described as the business as usual or worst case scenario trajectory, because that is not only pretty awful, but it seems to be the one we have been traveling. What we're looking at here is what the temperature trends are likely to be by the end of the century. Now, I tend to focus on the worst case scenario because I think that's the one we should be planning for and hoping we don't experience. The point to note is that the range by the end of the century is going to be an increase in temperature from something approaching 8 degrees Fahrenheit to near something about 16 degrees Fahrenheit above that baseline of 1981 to 2010. The median for those projections is somewhere around 11 degrees, or which is something like 6.1 degrees centigrade. So if we follow that business as usual worst case scenario trajectory, we're looking at a warming of something like 6 degrees centigrade above that 1981 to 2010 baseline by the end of the century. And I draw your attention to this because in a moment we're going to start looking at the implication of climate change for natural ecosystems. These are the data from I should point out that the preceding data come from the U.S. Geological Survey. These projections come from the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, and you can see that their projections are pretty much in the same ballpark. If we look at the SSP5, we're looking at something between 6 and a little under 14 degrees increase by the end of the century, again, according to that worst case scenario. If we now look at precipitation, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, if we look through the century, their average of 28 models suggests that on average, the precipitation will not change very much in Oregon in terms of average annual precipitation. However, it may be that the wet years will become wetter and the dry years become drier, and it seems that it doesn't matter which of those shared socioeconomic pathways we look at, we get pretty much the same trend. Pretty flat. On the other hand, if we look at the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute data, what they suggest is, again, pretty flat, but maybe a slight increase in precipitation as we go through the century. I won't pause now to talk about how seasonal patterns may be different. That was something I discussed last time. What I want to do now is talk about individual organisms. My background is in biology, and so when I think of the implications of climate change, my tendency is always to think in the biological terms. So we'll start by looking at the physiological tolerance of individual organisms. And I'm showing you a graph in which the horizontal axis represents the range for some critical environmental condition for an organism. And it could be temperature, salinity, soil moisture, or whatever. On the vertical axis, we're looking at how the organism exhibits growth, reproductive activity, and its general health. So these represent the response of the organism to some variation in an environmental condition. And so if you think of that in terms of of temperature, you'll see conditions can be either too hot or too cold for an organism to survive. In addition to the individual response of organisms to these environmental conditions, we can look at this in a slightly different way, and we can say to ourselves, so if we want to find this organism happens to be a northern bobwhite, so don't worry about that. But if we want to find this organism, what we should do is go where all of the environmental conditions that are important in the life and health of that organism are at their optimum. And if we do that, what we're doing is looking at what's called the ecological niche of that population or species of organisms. And what we'll find is the population density of whatever species we're looking at follows pretty much exactly the same curve as the physiological tolerance curve. We'll find way more of them where conditions are optimum, and I think that makes perfectly good sense. And if you want to think of yourself in terms of temperature, you can think of how you respond to this. You can survive in conditions which are a little cooler than your optimum or a little warmer, but if it goes too far out of your optimum, then you're probably not going to survive. Now, what I want to do is talk about the ecological implications of this. And I'm doing this in relation to a graph which was developed originally by Robert Whittaker back in the 1970s. And the graph I'm showing you, I modified from Bob Whittaker's original graph. And what you can see is we're looking at, on the horizontal axis, precipitation, and on the vertical, mean annual temperature in degrees centigrade. And what we're going to do is look at where natural biomes and natural ecosystems exist on the planet. Now, these are the two variables that are most critical in determining where natural ecosystems exist on the planet: average temperature and average precipitation. Now, it turns out that all of the natural ecosystems on the planet exist in a triangle, which is like that. The reason for that is simply conditions in the top right of that triangle, of that graph, just don't exist. So conditions on our planet are all within that triangle. So if we start labeling these, we'll see what the kinds of conditions as we go down the diagonal we're looking at. From the top left, we're looking at Arctic alpine climates down through cold temperate to warm temperate. And down on the bottom right, not surprisingly, where it's a wet and very warm, it's a tropical climate. Okay, now what I'm going to do is start putting onto this chart the natural ecosystems of the planet. I'm going backwards, not forwards, excuse me. And I'm going to show you what this means for the location in Oregon where I live, which has a precipitation, our annual average of about 21 inches 53 centimeters, and an average temperature of about 52.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 11.5 degrees centigrade. So I'm going to put the Rogue Valley on the chart, and that's where I live. Let's start looking at where natural ecosystems across the planet exist in relation to this chart. So where I live, the basic natural ecosystem would be some combination of woodland, shrubland, or grassland. Let's start moving away from where I live and look at where natural ecosystems exist across the planet. Up in the top, where it's really cold and really dry, we're in tundra, and that could be Arctic tundra or alpine tundra. If we come down to the bottom left of the chart, where it's hot and dry, we're in a hot desert. And then if we come over to the bottom right, we're in a tropical rainforest. And I'll just scatter the other natural ecosystems across the planet on the chart. Now, the important thing that for me to say right here is these represent the natural ecosystems across the planet. And the nice thing about this chart that Robert Whittaker developed was that if you tell me what the average precipitation and average temperature are anywhere on the planet, we can go to this chart and we can identify exactly what kind of natural ecosystem would occur in that location. Now, we can't predict what the species are going to be because species are different, as you will probably appreciate. As a result of evolutionary history, the species that exist in the tropical rainforests of Australia, for example, and Southeast Asia and the Americas are different just because of the different evolutionary trajectories that have occurred in those parts of the world. But these are the basic, this is where the basic natural ecosystems of the world occur. And what I want to say as a brief aside is when I was teaching, it was when I was teaching a course in ecology at Southeast Missouri State University, where I taught for 30 years. It was when I was teaching this segment of the course on what determines the distribution of natural ecosystems or biomes across the planet. This was the moment that really many years ago, several decades ago, got me really concerned about the whole climate issue because I started looking at the climate projections and looking at this chart, and I started realizing what's going to happen if those climate projections actually come to pass. And what you can see is if the climate changes by only a few degrees from our current location, what we're going to be doing is shifting the climate out of the range which supports the natural ecosystem that exists in that location. And I'll illustrate that because from the perspective of where I live. So if we increase the precipitation, for example, we're going to be shifting the climate from one that supports the woodland, shrubland, or grassland kinds of communities to a temperate coniferous forest. On the other hand, if we reduce the precipitation a little, we're shifting the climate to one that supports a cold desert. On the other hand, in terms of temperature, which as I was depicting a moment ago, is the main factor, that variable that's going to change as we go through the century in Oregon, what we're going to be doing is shifting, if we increase the temperature, we're going to be shifting where I live from that woodland, shrubland, grassland kind of climate towards a savanna, thorn woodland, or hot desert. On the other hand, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. If we actually reduce the temperature here, we're shifting ourselves away from that woodland to more towards a boreal coniferous forest kind of climate. And this is the idea that really occurs to me that is disturbing from a biological point of view. We don't have to change the temperature very much to shift it out of the range which supports current natural ecosystems, and we can say this is pretty much true across the planet, just as I demonstrated it where I live in southwestern Oregon. Now, as the temperature changes, we get I think this is upside down. I'll gloss over this very quickly. The labels are upside down. Okay, because no, that's not. It's correct. Okay, so what's happening is the temperature conditions up on that our vertical axis are getting warmer, and so what's happening is as we go through global warming, what we're doing is providing climates are shifting such that the advancing edge of where range shift would occur for populations of organisms is at this end of the graph, at the upper end, because those areas are getting warmer. And at the lower end, what we're finding is these are the receding edges because temperatures are getting way too hot to support the natural ecosystems. So what we're seeing is, as you will appreciate probably, what we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere is populations of organisms are exhibiting range shifts north towards the pole. So the northerly end of the range is where they're advancing, and the southerly end of the range is getting too hot, and so the populations are receding there. I hope that makes sense. Now, the question we ask ourselves as biologists is, can these natural ecosystems easily adjust to the changing temperature? And what I'm going to say is not very easily. And I'm going to illustrate that with reference to a location that in which I was conducting research in southeast Missouri. This is a place called Big Oak Tree State Park. And it's called Big Oak Tree State Park because what you can see right in the middle of that photograph is one huge oak tree. Big Oak Tree State Park is a little state park. It's an island which has been preserved. And that's what Big Oak Tree State Park looked like as I was working in it. And you can see that little pond in the middle. It's not a crater. It's a human-made pond so people can go fishing. But what you can see is this little island, Big Oak Tree State Park, is surrounded by farmland. And so you can imagine Farmer Jones and Farmer Brown out there growing their soybeans and their cotton. And if the temperature is shifting, what's going to be happening is if these species that live in this Big Oak Tree State Park are going to survive, they're going to have to exhibit some kind of a range shift north. Now, if oak trees start growing in Farmer Brown's soybean field, what he's going to do right away is whack them off. So our agricultural activities are standing in the way of natural ecosystems from exhibiting any kind of range shift, if you like, to follow the climate that is changing. And so one of the impediments to range shift is our agricultural systems. And there are other impediments, and one of them is the natural ability of species to exhibit dispersal. That is for the propagules of organisms to shift. And so I ask you to imagine a pine tree and ask yourself, where do the pine cones fall? And the answer is pretty much all the pine cones fall right underneath the tree. And so the capacity of a population of pine trees to exhibit range shift is limited because of the location of where the seeds fall. So natural ecosystems don't have an innate capacity to exhibit a very rapid range shift. And another impediment that we impose on natural ecosystems is our living, our infrastructure. And I use this image of St. Louis to illustrate that, but I'll take you to Portland in a moment to illustrate the same problem. So what if we look at the extent of St. Louis in 1972, that's what it looked like. By 1999, St. Louis was like that. And so what we're seeing is our human habitation, our human infrastructure is expanding. And that means we are ourselves serving as barriers to the capacity of natural ecosystems to exhibit a significant and rapid range shift, certainly a range shift that is required considering the rate at which we're imposing um, global warming on our planet. Now I'll do the same thing for you for Portland. So that's Portland in 1956. That's the Portland boundary by 79. And there it is by 2023. So again, the same thing is happening in all of our cities. They're expanding. Urban expansion is happening. And so we are getting to become more and more serious barriers to the capacity of natural ecosystems to exhibit range shift. This is a chart. I'm going to show you a chart which was developed by these characters, Williams and Jackson, in 2007. And this chart really depicts exactly what was getting my attention several decades ago as I was teaching that ecology class. And so what these folks did was they looked at what the climate projections were suggesting for the future, and they asked, where can current natural ecosystems across the planet exist as we go into the future? And they looked at what at that time was called the business as usual carbon dioxide scenario. They looked at carbon dioxide rising to 850 parts per million. And so that was in that era called the A1 scenario. And they looked at the B1 scenario where there was not quite such a serious increase in carbon dioxide, only up to about 550 parts per million. Now, the point to appreciate is it isn't the concentration of carbon dioxide that is what's driving the pattern we're about to look at, but it's the climate, particularly the global temperature, that is a consequence of that increased carbon dioxide concentration. What we're going to look at is two graphs of the planet, one at each of these concentrations. When you look at the graph, what I want you to realize is where you see red, the probability of the current natural ecosystem that occurs in that location occurring in the future under those conditions is zero. If red, it's zero. If blue, the probability is 1. So 1 is okay. Red is not a good future. And they looked at a limit in range. So they asked the question, will the climate be suitable within 500 kilometers, which is about 310 miles, of the current location of that natural ecosystem? And they picked that as a reasonable expectation given the limited range shift that I just discussed, that natural ecosystems exhibit. So now we'll look at the chart. Okay, you can see where it's blue. The left-hand side is the business as usual future, 850 parts per million. And what you can see is much of the planet is in red. In other words, that means there is nowhere within 500 kilometers of the current location of that natural ecosystem that the climate will be appropriate for that particular natural ecosystem. Now, when we're looking at the 850 parts per million, that's an increase in temperature of about 5 degrees centigrade or about 9 degrees Fahrenheit. So the left-hand side is the business as usual, A1 scenario, 850 parts per million. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at not such a bad future, only 550 parts per million, which is an increase of maybe 3.5 degrees centigrade or 6.3 or so degrees Fahrenheit. And what you can see there is the future is not quite so bleak across the planet. There are many more areas on the planet which have the potential of finding somewhere that they can exist climate-wise within that 500-kilometer limit of where they currently exist. But if we follow that business as usual scenario, I think on the left-hand side, well, I think what you can see is the future is bleak for pretty much the whole of Africa and at least for the northern part of South America into Central America. Things are maybe not quite so bad as that where we live in Oregon, but they're still not very promising. This chart really captured the level of concern that I was feeling as I first started thinking about the future, biological future of natural ecosystems and the climate projections that I was seeing. And that's what exactly got me into this situation where I felt I had to understand the climate science to decide if it was credible, because if it's credible, then we have to do something, is where I was. Now, a lot of people might say, well, so what? So what about all these natural ecosystems across the planet and all the biodiversity that they support? So this is a depiction of the major biomes across the planet right now. And I know you can't read the chart on the bottom left, but it doesn't really matter because the point I'm trying to make is these variables of temperature and precipitation don't just determine where our natural ecosystems exist on the planet, they also determine where our agriculture is successful. So we have this problem that the projections that we're looking at are not just going to compromise natural ecosystems. And of course, natural ecosystems are in many respects our life support system because that's what provides us with our watersheds, our clean water, et cetera, et cetera. But also for anybody who likes to eat, and I think that's probably most of us, it's important to understand that these variables are going to compromise our agricultural systems and our forestry systems, of course. So let's have a look now quickly at the future of agriculture, and I'm going to pick a few examples to illustrate the problem. One of the things that you will often hear folks who are climate skeptics say is, oh, carbon dioxide's a plant food. They use it in photosynthesis. So if we include the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, our agriculture is going to be better. We're going to have to be able to grow things much better. One of the things that they totally fail to appreciate is there are impacts on agricultural crops that result from the increased carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. And one of these is the nutritional composition of the plants. And you can see there in wheat, as the concentration of carbon dioxide increases to about 550 parts per million, you can see the concentration of zinc, iron, and protein in the crop decreases, and as does the concentration of phytate. Phytate sabotages our ability to uptake zinc. So if the phytate is reduced, that's not so bad. But if you look at rice, you can see the phytate concentration, the phytate uptake, the phytate concentration is actually increasing. So that's depressing even more in rice our ability to uptake zinc. So what you can see across those crops is, with the potential exception of sorghum, is a tendency for the crops to exhibit reduced nutrition. That is particularly critical, not just for us, but it's critical for um, insects that eat the crops. I'm going to look at now grape varietals. Um, I live in Southern Oregon in the Applegate Valley, and which is one of the prime wine growing areas, certainly in the United States, if not the world. And so I'm very sensitive to what climate change is likely to do to grape varietals. That's just a local example. It's one of our local crops. And what I want to do here is illustrate what is happening. Historically, we've been we've had a absolutely wonderful climate for Pinot Gris and some of those colder optimal temperature grape varietals. But as we go through the century, the climate is going to shift to the right. And what's going to happen is the grape varietals that are going to be successful where we live here are not going to be as successful in the future. And so what's happening, interestingly, is a lot of the vineyards down here are already switching to some of the warmer growing season grapes, things like Chardonnays and Pinot Noirs and so forth. Now, the catch is if we follow that worst case scenario, we are liable, and this is true for where I live, potentially true for Oregon, we're liable to have a climate which is only suitable in the growing season for growing table grapes and raisins. This illustrates one particular crop. The changing climate that we're imposing on Oregon is going to require vineyards to change the crops, the grape varietals they're growing. But the same is going to be true for any other crop, whether a person is growing soybeans, alfalfa, or what. This pattern is liable to impact them, and so the farmers are going to have to start looking for warmer season crops. Down here, where there are some folks who are already doing this with grains, they're looking for grains that grow better under much drier, hotter conditions. And folks around here are actually trying to grow those grains to replace the historical grains that have been grown in the area. So the point that I'm trying to make is these climate trends are going to have tremendous implications for our agricultural systems. What I was looking at there was just the impact of temperature change, because of course it's ridiculous to simply say, well, all we're doing if we increase the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is increase the carbon dioxide concentration. We're also changing the temperature. And this illustrates the problem of increasing the temperature in terms of crop production. What you can see here on the left-hand side is plant growth rate and in response to increasing temperature. The green line represents the vegetative response curve, the meaning just the growth rate. The purple curve, on the other hand, represents the crop yield response. And what you can see potentially is increasing temperature might well be wonderful for the ability of corn plants to grow big, strong, bold, and brave. And that would be great if we ate corn leaves, but we don't. We eat the seeds, the reproductive output. And what you can see very clearly is the optimum temperature for reproductive output of corn is in the middle 60s, maybe up as high as 70. And if we start warming our agricultural systems beyond that, what we're going to do is depress the reproductive output, the corn production of our corn plants. And you can see what the problem is. The same is true for soybeans, not surprisingly. They're not identical. It's not the identical optimum vegetation response. That's not the same as corn, slightly different. But again, you can see for soybeans, the reproductive output drops if the temperature rises much above 70s. They may again be growing big, bold, brave, and strong, but that's no help to us because we need the beans. Increased carbon dioxide may be positive, but increased temperature is largely negative. Let's look at some patterns in crop loss with temperature. So this is what happens as the temperature rises in the case of rice. It's kind of interesting. What you can see is as the temperature rises, the reproductive output drops to an inflection point, and then it starts dropping rapidly if we go beyond that. Notice how that inflection point is about 3 degrees centigrade. And the drop in reproductive output above that is much faster, much greater than before that. Let's have a look at wheat. It has an inflection point as well, 2.38, and above that, the rate of loss of crops increases rapidly for every 1 degree centigrade increase. Interestingly, each part per million carbon dioxide increase does result in an increase in reproductive output, but that's countered by the loss due to the temperature. If we look at maize, corn, you can see it doesn't have an inflection point. It simply results in a reduction in output at a consistent rate for every degree centigrade the temperature increases. But interestingly, for corn, each part per million carbon dioxide increase actually depresses the crop production. So increased carbon dioxide, again, is not a universal benefit. For corn, it's actually a disadvantage. Let's have a look now quickly at a future of our forests. This is the sort of historical Douglas fir distribution. And on the left-hand side, I have the whole of Oregon. On the right-hand side, this is just Southwest Oregon. This is where it grows now. Let's have a look at what the future climate for Oregon will likely do to Douglas fir. Where you're seeing the purple color, that's a high viability climate. Where you're seeing a yellow or green, that's a low viability climate. And where you're seeing gray, the tree species simply can't grow. Let's look towards the end of the century, and you can see how the climate is going to have a very negative impact on Douglas fir. And what's interesting is you can see on the left-hand side, we're looking at the whole of Oregon, and the Douglas fir, according to the climatic conditions, is going to be confined pretty much to higher elevation on the Cascade Sierras and up in the northeast of Oregon. If you look on the right-hand bottom right chart, which is where I live in Southwest Oregon, you can see as we go through the century, the climate is going to start to become particularly unsuitable for Douglas fir. In fact, what we're seeing right now is a substantial amount of Douglas fir die-off occurring throughout the Applegate Valley, which is where I live, and even up into the Umpqua Valley. And what you can see is how that is going to continue as we go through the century. And this is how it's likely to be impacting Douglas fir. Now, Douglas fir, as most people appreciate, is the most important commercial species, forest species in Oregon. By far, more Douglas fir is logged than anything else. And this is one of to me, kind of paradoxical patterns. What we see is folks in the timber industry seem to be among the most resistant to appreciating the impact of global warming on our natural ecosystems and even acknowledging that global warming is happening. So there's a tremendous amount of pushback from a lot of folks in forestry. And by the same token, I'm always surprised that people in agriculture aren't incredibly sensitive to the patterns that I've been describing. So that's the Douglas fir. Let's have a look at one or two other species. This is ponderosa pine, which is intrinsically a drier climate species to Douglas fir. So ponderosa pine, as we go through the century, again, you can see those areas where the ponderosa pine is likely to be successful are reduced. The Gary oak, I was curious because the Douglas fir and ponderosa pine are likely to exhibit reductions in their range across the state. I was trying to find something that was going to do better. And so I wondered about the oak trees. So I looked at the Gary oak. These data come from a team of researchers that were based in Montana and were looking at what they call climate envelopes, which basically means they're looking at where the climate where these tree species historically have existed and asking the question, where is that climate going to exist into the future? So this is the climate envelope for the Gary oak as we go into the future. Now, this one was kind of interesting because you can see optimal conditions, the purple colors, are much reduced, but there might be an expansion of suboptimal conditions for the Gary oak across the western part of Oregon. But it's not the Gary oak's going to do incredibly well if the climate changes as we fear it might. These three charts are a little more disturbing. Lodgepole pine, Sitka spruce, and western hemlock now. Let's go into the future. And you can see both the lodgepole pine and the Sitka spruce. By the end of the century, Oregon is going to be climatically out of the range of these species, and the western hemlock is going to be substantially reduced. If we look at high elevation species, I'm not sure that I've included these. No, I haven't. If we look at high elevation fir and pine species, we find they are likely to be totally eliminated from the state, just as the lodgepole pine and the Sitka spruce are depicted here. So a lot of times folks will ask me, so after I've gone through this, so what do you think our forests are going to look like in the future? And so here we have Joshua trees. I don't know whether Joshua trees have the capacity to exhibit range shift such that they can reach Oregon by the end of the century. I suspect not, but it's expected, for example, that by the end of the century, Southwest Oregon will have the climate equivalent to Delano, which is just outside Bakersfield, which is just this side of the Cascades or the Sierras from the Joshua trees. What about wildfires? Always a great question. What we're looking at here is a chart of the area burned, which has been developed by the Oregon Department of Forestry, and this covers the areas of forest, not just publicly owned, but the areas of forest that the ODF historically has managed in relation to fire. What we're looking at is you can go back to 1910, and the brown these represent the area burned, and the white line represents the frequency of fire initiations. So the white is the 10-year trend in the number of fires that have been initiated in the area managed by the Oregon Department of Forestry. The brown bars represent, notice that the trend in number of initiations is dropping in the 1940s to 1950s. The 10-year trend in acres burned is the brown to sort of purple color. You can see that drops substantially also in the 1940s. Coincidentally, that is exactly the same time that the Smokey Bear campaign was launched, which was designed to suppress any fire that started. And that pattern has been existing in North America since about the 1910s, 1920s. But the Smokey Bear campaign was particularly successful in putting fires out once they started. There is something else that's going on here that is going to be depicted in just a moment, and this is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. This is a natural oscillation which exists in the Northern Pacific and it impacts particularly coastal North America. And so what's been happening is through the last century, that Pacific Decadal Oscillation, as you can see here, was shifting from a cool, moist phase, which was where it was right at the beginning of the last century, to a warm phase and back to a cool phase and back to a warm phase. And what you can see is the area burned dropped as we shifted, as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation shifted in the 1940s from that warm phase to the cool phase. And so it's the general thinking is that the reduction in area burned in terms of forests in Oregon is in some way a combination of the impact of that successful Smokey Bear campaign suppressing fires and the natural transition from the Pacific Decadal Oscillation warm phase to the cool phase. So what's happening now as we go to the right is that Pacific Decadal Oscillation has really been superseded by global warming. And so what we're experiencing now is a general increase in area burned. But I think the important thing to notice is, with the exception of maybe 2020, the area burned even today is not as great as it was back in the early decades of the last century. So we have a combination of phenomena taking place that are impacting wildfires in North America, particularly the western states, Oregon. This chart illustrates a pattern now going back. This one goes back 1,400 years, but these authors also went back 3,000 years. And what they're doing is demonstrating how climate relates to area burned. So as we're looking at this chart, the gray area represents area burned. The red line represents the 100-year trend line for the average of area burned. And the black line represents what climate models suggested should be the area burning given the climate of that period. And what I think you can see is that the modeled climate expectation for area burned follows very closely the actual historic data for area burned. And what's really disturbing is when we come up to the last few decades, you can see the black dotted line shows a dramatic rise, whereas the actual area burned drops. So that is called the late 20th century fire deficit. In other words, what we should be experiencing in the Western United States is much larger areas being burned than are actually burning, and that is most likely a function of to a large extent, our successful fire suppression plans and activities. But we should be anticipating that as we go into the future and we get more and more climate change, what we're going to be seeing is an increase in the risk of wildfire. Climate change is clearly increasing the wildfire risk. I'm going to close with a couple of slides. I think I've got a couple. One of the things that those of us concerned about climate change often get a sense is there aren't very many people out there who actually accept the science. The Yale Program on Climate Change Communication is constantly conducting research on people's attitudes. And what I'm going to show you is attitudes in Oregon regarding the number of people, the percentage of the adults who are somewhat or very worried about global warming. And you can see the legend is there. What's interesting is if you look at this chart, you will see the change from sort of blue to yellow represents the switch from minus under 50% to over 50% of the population. So there are actually only a couple of counties in Oregon where fewer than 50% of the population are somewhat or very worried about global warming. The national average interest, incidentally, in the last time they did this survey was 63%. On the other hand, Multnomah County, you can see, comprises a population that's very concerned about the issue. Okay, so what I want to do, the reason I showed that is, whilst we have a tendency to think folks are concerned, it seems that across most of Oregon, the majority of the population actually is concerned, and in Multnomah County, it's a really high percentage. Okay, so that wraps up my discussion of basically the biological implications of climate projections. So if you want to ask some questions, I can sit here for a while and see what I can do. Okay, I can see Edward had a question.
Yeah. It seemed like the coast was going to be the least forest fastest.
Yeah, and I think it was a combination of the coastal species like the Sitka spruce and the high elevation species, because what's happening is the coastal climate, the coastal species are very adapted to that mild coastal climate. And even though when we were looking at climate projections last time, it was clear that the coastal areas are liable to experience less severe shift in climate than the inland species. It's what's important to appreciate is that because coastal climates are much less severe in terms of severely hot and severely cold or severely wet and severely dry, the climate historically there has been much more modulated, the range is much lower. And so it doesn't take much of a shift in climate to shift the climate out of the range with which those species have been adapted.
Well, in a similar way to the way grape growing has moved north and south to different areas, I can't help but wonder if California trees might be better for Oregon in the future, and to what extent anybody's looked at that.
Well, that is something that foresters are very much aware of. There's a process called assisted migration, where folks in forestry, particularly they're trying to grow crops, are looking at importing into Oregon the genotypes of species. For example, Douglas fir has a wide range across its distribution in terms of climate. So rather than trying to grow Douglas fir trees in Oregon that come from seeds of Oregon trees, if we're looking into the future, it makes sense to consider planting Douglas fir trees that come from seeds from further south, as you're suggesting. And certainly folks in forestry are looking at that. The downside of that is um, two things. One is um, seedlings tend to be much more, and I think that it's reasonable, much more sensitive than the mature trees. And so in order to plant a Douglas fir tree that's going to be appropriate for the climate in Oregon in the future, the first thing we have to know is what that climate is going to be like in the future. And we don't know that when we're not that sure about what it's going to be. And the second thing is we have to plant a seedling now that is acclimated to the climate that Oregon is going to be in 30 or 40 years. And so that seedling is quite possibly not going to do anywhere near as well as the seedling from a local source. So it's a bit of a tricky conundrum to try and resolve.
Yeah, well, if their trees are going to take 50 to 100 years to grow to full size, uh, to affect this century, they need to happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, we need to do, yeah, yeah. And I can say, I will say that forestry folks are looking at this, but
Good.
yeah, but as I sort of depicted, it's a bit of a trick to try and figure out what the best way to go is. I think Alan had a question. Yeah.
Alan, can you say anything about the implications for insect populations in the national and Oregon area, especially those that are concerned with our food production?
Oh, yeah, I can. My background is in entomology, so this, yeah, so you're hitting me with right down my wheelhouse, I guess. I didn't talk about the impact of temperature on uh, ectotherms and endotherms, which is another subject that I tend to talk about when I'm teaching this stuff. But one of the things that happens is, and this I think makes sense to folks, organisms that are ectothermic, i.e., cold-blooded, we think of, which includes all plants and insects, they are very susceptible to temperature because their growth rate increases as the temperature rises up to a point, and then beyond that, they're fried. And so what what's happening with climate change is, well, particularly global warming, is we're generating conditions where insects are much better able to grow rapidly, to increase their populations, and particularly important in the case of a lot of our tree insect species, the borers, is they overwinter in much larger numbers. So when spring comes around, the number of insects in the population starts off to be much larger. And the warmer spring and the warmer summer allows the populations to build up much more rapidly. So that's one angle. And the other angle, which is an interesting one, is that many tree species have they have a limited capacity to respond to drying conditions. And one of the physiological responses trees have, if they're subjected to stress, drought stress, for example, is they mobilize the proteins in their tissues and turn them into what are called free amino acids. And there's a physiological benefit to this because that increased osmotic potential of the fluid in the tree resists evaporative water loss. So that's great in terms of drought. Unfortunately, the downside for those tree species is insect herbivores, as a rule, tend to be nitrogen limited. And so when the tree species mobilize that protein into free amino acids, they're actually making themselves incredibly more nutritious to the insects. So the insects get better food and a much nicer climate, and so their populations build up more rapidly. So climate change is having a negative impact on our forests because it's encouraging the rapid increase in spring and summer of many of those insect herbivores.
How about honeybees?
Honeybees are interestingly, they one of the things I was showing, you will recall, was a reduction in the nutritional composition of plants as we experience increasing carbon dioxide concentration. Interestingly, the same thing happens to pollen, and that really does have a negative impact on honeybees. So the honeybees, they might have a positive response to the increasing temperature, but they have a negative response to the reduced nutritional composition of the pollen that's critical for their growth.
Thank you.
Alan, it's 10 minutes after.
Okay.
And someone really has a question they have to ask, please do. But Alan, I don't know.
My email is there, Mike. So if somebody has a question, please shoot me an email.
And Alan, you may have noticed that I didn't start the recording in time. The